I don't know. Say it with me. I don't know. Good God, it is liberating. I am a towering mountain of ignorance. I don't know. We're taught to believe that everything has a reason. Now, I'm glad that we have the desire to understand the world. That results in all sorts of great stuff. We want to know everything. We're humans. We're curious. And maybe it's our culture. Maybe it's just humanity. But I think a lot of the time we end up mixing up thinking something with knowing something. Suddenly, I know that I don't know. But somehow everyone else seems to know. They all know differently from each other, but they all seem to know. What I'm saying is nobody's opinions are correct in the world. And yet it's impossible not to tie your opinions to your concept of self. And often people tie those things so closely together that they begin defending their guesses as if they're defending their very lives. In a way, they are. This is why it can be so impossible to talk about certain topics with certain people. They've tied those suppositions to themselves so tightly with knots of narrative and constructed reality and values that there's just no untying it. And maybe unsurprisingly, in those situations, the best course of action is just to be friends. The world as we perceive it, as we've built it inside of ourselves, is a lie that we tell to ourselves, not out of deception, but out of necessity. We simply cannot understand the world as it is, and so we construct. But sometimes I just have to tell myself the thing that is definitely true, the truest thing I can say, which is that I don't know.
Never know.
This is the Everyone's Agnostic Podcast with Bob Pondillo and Cass Midgley.
I have to say, anybody who meets me, if they think I'm anything but a woman, that's not my problem. I'm clearly a woman. I present as a woman. I say I'm a woman. My name is Marissa. That's all it should take. Just because I was born differently than most people does not mean I'm invalid, and it does not mean that someone else has more of a right to my identity than I do. There are plenty of reasons I can say that I'm a woman, but the number one reason is that I say I'm a woman.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 197 of the Everyone's Agnostic Podcast. I'm Cass Midgley. Today I talk with Marissa McCool. Bob was out of town for this taping. This episode is a bit of a detour from our regular format. Marissa doesn't have a personal deconversion from faith story, but she does have a gender conversion story that religions generally oppose. I call this episode, much like episode 60 with Callie Wright back in the summer of 2015, a beginner class in Trans 101. I support this kind of education because in order to be a part of the solution and not the problem, we need to seek to understand, stretch out our imaginations, and expose our blind spots regarding these fellow human beings. And of course, say yes to what is. Also, we ex-Christians can relate to this. One can only lie about who one is for so long before going crazy. Author Ellen Wittlinger is quoted as saying, "People change lots of personal things all the time. They dye their hair and diet themselves to near death. They take steroids to build muscles and get breast implants and nose jobs so they'll resemble their favorite movie stars. They change their names and majors and jobs and husbands and wives. They change religions and political parties. They move across the country or the world, even change nationalities. Why is gender the one sacred thing we aren't supposed to change? And who made that rule?" Unquote. Our guest today, Marissa Alexa McCool, is 32, a podcaster, author, performer, speaker, and an LGBT rights/atheist activist. She's a trans woman, married, partnered, and she's a parent. Born in Akron, Ohio, and currently residing in St. Paul, Minnesota with her family, she graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in 2017 with 3 degrees, English, Cinema and Media Studies, and Anthropology, while also studying theater, Shakespeare, and communication theory. Within the atheist community, she's spoken at Lee Valley Humanists, Minnesota Atheists, Skepticon 10, NanoCon 3, and several others. Marissa won a 2014 Keystone Award for Excellence in Journalism, a 2015 Audience Choice Award at the Hershey Student Film Festival for a short film, and she co-founded the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative with Callie Wright in 2017. She blends her theatrical background and fiery passion for atheism, humanism, and secular values. In this interview, Marissa mentions a video by Steve Shives on this trans subject, and I feature a 5-minute excerpt from it in the middle of the conversation. We taped this conversation on March 24th, 2018.
We interview people you don't know about a subject no one wants to talk about. We hope to encourage people in the process of deconstructing their faith and help curb the loneliness that accompanies it. We think the world is a better place when more people live by sight, not by faith. Please subscribe to our podcast and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts.
Also, we offer these podcasts freely, and your support truly makes a difference. You can support us monetarily in 2 easy ways. You can pledge a monthly donation through Patreon. That's patreon.com/EA podcast. Or you can leave a lump sum donation through PayPal at our website, everyone'sagnostic.com. And I want to remind everyone that Patreon changed in January from a per episode donation to a monthly donation, and it has cut our donations in half, from $400 a month to $200 a month. And so I think there might be some who intended to pledge, say, $1 or $2 per episode, and they are now pledging $1 or $2 per month. If you intended to give $5 or $10 a month, then you might have to change your pledge from $1 or $2 to $5 or $10. It would be greatly appreciated. Our opening monologue is an excerpt from a YouTube by Hank Green titled Towering Mountain of Ignorance. The music behind it is Never Know by Jack Johnson. Thank you for listening, and be a yes-sayer to what is.
Hello.
Hey,
How are you this morning?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing all right.
Is it Marissa or Marissa?
Marissa.
Marissa. Well, we met at NanoCon this last weekend. We could go today, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And we sat on a panel together, and I was just, I don't know if it was your quick wit or just something that I just was like, wow, this is an impressive person. So I reached out and I said, hey, will you come on the show? And of course you did. And you got your own show. Let's go ahead and just plug that up front. What's the name? You got 2 shows, or?
I have 2 shows, yes. I'm also a producer, but I'll talk about that later. My main show is the Inciting Incident podcast. We just put out our 135th episode, so we've been around for a little while. And my other show is a trans-specific podcast called The Cis Are Getting Out of Hand. It's kind of a comedy, satirical show at looking at trans issues without the consideration of having to stop and do 101 all the time. So it's definitely a niche, but it's a niche that there are people who really need that niche.
Well, today's going to be 101 because I am on the spectrum of like sexual orientation. I'm kind of a Kinsey scale believer. Do you have any thoughts on, people saying, well, I'm about 80% bi? Is that bullshit, or?
I think it's far more complicated than anyone is willing to admit, and that's even people who believe it's all on a spectrum. Mm-hmm. I just think our brains have been taught to think on a binary so much that whenever we have to think outside of that, it's really difficult because we like having things in simple categories.
I totally agree.
But of course, nature, science, and humans are not that easy.
Far from simple.
So I think a lot of the resistance from gender divergence, sexuality divergence, and pretty much anything that isn't cut and dry, it comes from a place where people have settled that question in their minds, and it's really tough to break them of that because it's a lot harder to think about, and you have to learn new things. And as we know, many people in the world are very resistant to that.
Yeah. All right, so I guess I'm curious as to what's your thoughts behind the title of one of your podcasts, Inciting Incident. Where's that come from?
Well, the show originally started as a film podcast. One of the 3 things I was studying at the University of Pennsylvania was film. And for those who have studied even Film 101, the inciting incident is a trope, meaning in the typical storytelling/movie narrative, the inciting incident is the moment in the story where the protagonist has the choice to go on an adventure or stay. And they, of course they go because that's how stories work. Mm-hmm. So we thought it was a clever name, and, we started doing a film podcast, but my heart wasn't in it. I love movies. I love talking about movies, but I started the podcast in 2016, and just as everything was going on, it was like 5-6 episodes in, and I just felt like I had so many more important things to talk about.
Yeah.
So at one point we were trying to do 2 episodes a week, one where we would talk about social things and atheism and the election, and the other we would try to do film, and it just evolved into what it is today, which is mostly personal narrative interview podcast where we try to get to know people and have some in-depth and emotional conversations.
Yeah.
So, but I didn't want to change the name because I like the name of the podcast.
Yeah.
So that's where the name comes from.
So what jumpstarts or pushes the protagonist out the door is the inciting incident. Mm-hmm. And you got honest with yourself about being trans. And so, right? That's kind of the something in your book, you call it kicking down the door, coming out of the closet or whatever. And it was a big fuck you. And,
right.
So yeah, I've been reading, the book. Oh my gosh. I can't remember the name of it. And I've only got
Passing Cars.
Passing Cars. No. So here we are talking about what's behind a name. Let's do what's behind the name Passing Cars.
Well, I'm also autistic, and I came to realize that when I was in college and I was having, I didn't pass a year of high school, and I had an A- average at an Ivy League school with 3 majors and a 100-mile commute. So I was doing well.
Yeah.
But when it came to learning a foreign language, there was just this huge disparity between my ability to take in and comprehend and read and to produce. And the professor pulled me aside because at Penn, you have to take 4 semesters of a foreign language to graduate. And at the 102 level, I was struggling so much. And the professor basically said, Marissa, there's something going on here that's beyond, not studying enough or not testing well. I think you should see students with disabilities. And through a very long, complicated, and expensive process, I ended up at a neurologist's office, and I went through a bunch of tests. That's what led to them figuring out that I was autistic, is that there's certain levels of reasoning and abstract thought and memory issues that I have extreme difficulty with. But because I excelled in other things, no one ever really looked at it.
Yeah.
And the way I've always been able to process difficult conversations or ideas, which of course I later attributed to autism, is I can put things in a metaphor that people can find accessible, that they can picture and grab onto. And the cover of the book is a silhouette standing in the middle of a busy highway. And the reason I did that is because I describe the way my thought processes work, that I wake up and I'm in the middle of a busy highway, and everything that's going by is a thought, an idea, a memory. It's just everything's whizzing by at 100 miles an hour. And I have to focus on one and, just kind of get my brain warmed up and be like, okay, everything's going on right now. I need to do the New York Times crossword puzzle and just think about that car for about 5-10 minutes. Mm-hmm. And then I can find another one, which is make breakfast, or I can read a chapter of a book, just something that helps me pick out something in the busy highway that is my mind. And that makes it easier throughout the day.
Yeah.
But of course, there are also things that can throw me off and make me lose my focus, which makes the whole highway come back, and I kind of have to start over.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the app on the phone that's a guided meditation called Headspace?
Not specifically. I haven't done it myself, but I am familiar with the concept.
All right, so I did it. And the first 10 sessions are free, and then you can subscribe after that. But I think it was the 3rd or 4th session, and there's little computer graphics and cartoons and stuff. And they had one called, chasing cars or passing cars. And that it was a similar metaphor for people that are maybe anxious or depressed, and these cars are going by, and the temptation for the actor is to get out there and direct traffic or stop cars or try to, get in them or whatever. And sometimes, especially in the moment of meditation or just introspection, you're just to sit on the side of the road and watch. And they're just thoughts, and they're going by, and there they go. And there they go. And, it was just a tool for that. But, all right. So there's a lot going on here as far as obstacles for you to find yourself in a world that's really not suited, or at least not conducive for your own expression of who you are. And in not only, just in many fronts. So let's go back to your childhood. I mean, the nature of our show is we talk to people who deconverted from their childhood faith. So what did you have a religious upbringing?
I didn't have a personal religious upbringing, but my upbringing was living in an extremely religious, extremely conservative area of Pennsylvania. So while I didn't necessarily have a personal religion to get out of, I felt like everyone else's religion dictated everything I could do because I was subject to the influence and the perspective and the limitations that they would put on me because of it. So
it was the water you were swimming in, yeah.
Right. I had this rare combination of living in a super conservative school district and a super elitist school district. So at the same time, while it was, this is the way it is, this is the way our kids act, if you're different, it's your fault. It also had none of our kids are autistic. That's just made up. That's, we wouldn't have anything like that at our school. We're better than that.
Is it a prep school?
Not technically.
Magnet school?
No, it was a public school system, but just one of those that super, super elitist standards.
Affluent neighborhood?
I think that would be a good way to put it. Yeah. It's big school, huge football team. They're the kind that recruit people to come live in their area to play football. Yeah. So it was almost like a college in and of itself.
Mostly white?
Oh, God, yes.
Okay. And so that's Pennsylvania. You're the environment, whether you have taken it on personally or not, in America and especially in conservative parts of the country, it's going to be up in your business, no matter who you are. But especially, okay, so you got any siblings?
Yes, I have a younger sister, and she's about 4 years younger than me.
Okay.
And, she didn't deal with nearly as much as I did, but she was still affected by it.
Yeah, affected by what, religion?
Yes, yeah. In the culture that we grew up in.
Yeah. Your parents religious at all?
My mom is Methodist, but she's not, you need to get saved Methodist. It's more just, this is what my family does and it's important to me kind of Methodist. My dad was raised in a military family that was pretty conservative, but he's also, I think they would call it a fatalist, which is, when your number's up, so whatever. So I never really got much from that side. I think the issues I had with him growing up were more coming from the background that he did and not understanding that I was a different kind of kid, and what worked on him when he was growing up had the opposite effect on me.
So probably a strong disciplinarian.
Yes, and he grew up with my grandfather was military in the 50s and had that style of parenting, which was, I'm going to beat you down until you rise up and prove me wrong, which is, of course, a very military way of thinking. And his response to that was, okay, I'm going to do all this stuff and prove you wrong. Unfortunately, I was not unfortunately, but unfortunately for this particular situation, I was a very sensitive and emotional kid. And every time he would do that, it made me shut down. And he did not understand that until my 20s and until he could kind of have that retrospection, which didn't help me as a kid, but is at least nice to know that we could agree on that.
Yeah. So I don't know, a lot of machoism, or like, be a man, beat your chest?
I wouldn't even say that as much. It was there was, of course, I felt some deep-seated resentment that I wasn't like him, but it was more like, I give this as an example. When I was playing baseball, I was very good at baseball, but I had this bad habit of stepping out of the batter's box instead of stepping forward because I was afraid of getting hit by the pitch. So his solution was to take me out to a field, both of us, and throw baseballs at me for an hour. And yeah, it got me to stop stepping out for a while because I was afraid to step at all. But, that was the mentality. It was, I'm going to, force you to confront this fear you have until, whatever. And I don't resent him for it.
It's well intended, but it's misguided for sure.
Right. And I was not a typical kid in many ways. And I realize most of that in retrospect, of course, but it's hard to ignore the effect it had on me too.
Absolutely. So are your parents still together?
Yes, they are.
And you have a good relationship with them now?
Not really. We weren't that close. And once I came out, I would say it felt like I was a burden to them because of coming out as trans. Mm-hmm. And it's not like they willfully disrespected me or, denied who I was or anything like that, which is something a lot of trans kids and people have to go through. Yeah. But it was more, I was constantly reminded of how difficult it was on them and how much of a pain it was on them to learn new name, new pronouns, adjust, everything like that. Yeah. And it's difficult when you come out with something like that because you already feel like a burden. Mm-hmm. You already feel like being open about who I am is going to affect so many people, and you start to compromise yourself, and you protect yourself by saying, oh, well, I'm not going to make you do this, or I'm not going to get the surgery, or I'm not going to do whatever. Right. And you start from such a point that you're already trying to compromise. So to be reminded of just how much of a burden you are makes it really difficult to be emotionally available.
Yeah.
I live in Minnesota now, so there's a good distance between us, and we don't communicate that much just because there's not really a lot to talk about, and we weren't that close to begin with. Right. So like I said, we're just not that close.
Well, at the top of the show, in the context of Kinsey scale, you said, we talked about how complicated human beings are. And this, the scenario you just described reminds me of this, and that is when somebody is going through something internally, and they find themselves in a circumstance or an environment that is suppressive to who they are, to their voice, to their thoughts and ideas. Now, this can be a woman in a patriarchal marriage. This could be a black man or woman in a racist environment. This could be LGBT situations, where the culture does not welcome you to the table, open arms. Mm-hmm. And when these oppressed people just slightly raise their hand and say, hey, I'm here and I'd like to be myself, it's so common for those oppressors, unbeknownst, like you said with your dad throwing baseballs at you, there's well-intentioned and they're very confused and they don't know what they're doing. It's a giant blind spot. And yet, when this oppressed person raises their hand and says, can I be present and vocal and forthright, I'm telling you, man, the oppressor makes it about them. And all of a sudden, instead of it being something difficult and brave that the oppressed person has done, coming out of victimhood, really, or pushing back against insecurity and self-pity, saying, there's this brave thing that has just happened. And then the oppressor says, oh, this is really hard for me. Mm-hmm. And I'm just saying that as a part of, but that's complicated because, we could say, oh, these oppressors are assholes, or they're mean, or they are ignorant. I mean, we could say that. But I don't know. I don't like the blame game anywhere it shows up. But I do like it when both parties say, I want to be curious about how you're feeling and what's provoking this kind of behavior. as opposed to just assuming that it's malicious or mean or coming from a place of fear, or et cetera, et cetera.
That is important, especially for activists like myself, like Callie Wright, and some of the other trans activists that I work with on a frequent basis and, have on my podcast and everything. And that is, we have to be aware that for most people, the very first trans person they ever heard about was Caitlyn Jenner. And that is a very flawed person. And, we can talk about that.
Yeah, but not a representative of the whole.
Right.
No one is.
Everyone before that, for the most part, that had trans people in the consciousness at all was in movies. And in movies, we were either punchlines or serial killers. Mm-hmm. And when plot twists are that the person's trans, or that, they're Buffalo Bill and murdering people because they are trans, when you're suddenly going, actually, we're just people and we want to exist. That's what's in the public consciousness. We can say all we want that movies and media don't influence behavior, and to a point that's true, but when it's the only representation you've had of an idea, it's all you have to draw from.
Yeah.
So as a trans activist, we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to be cognizant of the fact that most people do not know. And that's why I'm willing to go out there and do 101 speeches and
like
conversations.
Today. Yeah.
Right. I don't mind doing that, because at least if I'm doing it, I'm secure and comfortable in who I am, and I'm coming from a relative place of privilege within my community. Yeah. An 18-year-old trans kid who's homeless and doesn't have anyone validating their identity shouldn't have to be the one who's sitting there explaining who they are to someone. They should just be able to go, yeah, this is my name, these are my pronouns, please let me have something to eat.
Yeah. Well, and until that's true, I think we can say of all things, even racism or any kind of bigotry, education is the answer. And here you are teaching 101, and you're willing to do that. And I appreciate it. I think you're making the world a better place. I think you're helping stretch people's periphery or imagination or scope to begin to include more people that before they didn't know what to do. And you mentioned movies and how trans are portrayed or whatever. And I just want to get your reaction. My first, what came to mind first was Jared Leto. Mm-hmm. Is that accurate? I can't remember what movie it was, but I just remember he dressed as a woman or something.
Right. I think the first thing that would come into public consciousness is the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Yeah.
And that used the word transvestite, which is a different thing, but it was also the first real gender variant portrayal of people like us that wasn't, oh, he's in a dress, that's hilarious. And, if you think about movies, especially in the 90s, that portrayed trans people, even using the wrong word, you have Silence of the Lambs, you have Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, where, we're either a serial killer or the twist is, oh my God, Lois Einhorn used to be Rafe Finkel. We should burn our clothes and put a plunger to our face because that's just so gross. And you had The Crying Game, where the fact that the person is trans is the plot twist, and the rest of the movie is the main character beating the shit out of that person. Or you have Boys Don't Cry, which is they find out that the person's trans and they murder them. So our representation, what little we had, was harmful in one way or the other.
Yeah.
But until recently, it was also the fact that trans roles were almost exclusively played by cis people. So it's been just not only trying to be visible and present in public consciousness and everyday life, it's been to say, hey, we exist too. Just because you saw a thing in a movie doesn't mean you understand our existence. Yeah. And that's okay, but maybe listen to us when we're talking about it.
You made me think of something. When I was in 6th grade, there was a pep rally at the high school, and we were just 6th graders, but because it was homecoming, somehow we got entered in to be a part of this pep rally. And it was me and about 6 or 7 of my guy friends. And we put on wigs and makeup and cheerleading outfits with pom-poms. And we did a cheer. Mm-hmm. And, I at the time, and, maybe right up until 5 minutes ago, I thought that was just all in good fun. But we were maybe... The subtext of that is we're making fun of men who dress up as women.
Or to be more detailed and different, people who are perceived as men for a while but are actually women too.
Yeah.
And that's a distinction, because there are men who just like to wear women's clothes.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because there are a lot of things going on here. And I know you said a second ago this transvestite, and then there's, I'm just going to get real here. Is hermaphrodite somebody with both genitalia?
The term that, as far as I know, they prefer is intersex.
Well, yeah, nowadays, but back in the day, I think that's what it meant.
That's correct. That was a term that was used for a while.
Yeah, which I think, especially if you're a creationist or if you're a gods in control type of theological thinker, well, of course, they would just say, well, after the fall, sin entered the world, and so everything's corrupt. But just the fact that somebody, and then a baby has both genitalia, and obviously the baby can't inform you of how they identify.
Right.
And so, in a way, you could name that kid Bobby, or maybe Pat, some androgynous name that they could move smoothly into whatever gender they choose once they get of age to know how they identify. Have you ever? That's a storyline that's kind of strange. I think there was a Canadian couple once that had it wasn't intersex. It was, they just refused to identify the gender of their child until the child was old enough to identify it itself.
Yeah. That does happen, and it's not just genitalia too. There are males born with 2 X chromosomes. There are women born with a Y chromosome, and there's things like Klinefelter syndrome.
What's Klinefelter?
Klinefelter is born with an extra chromosome, so it ends up in sterility if it's in men, as far as I understand it. But there's all these different variants, and people love that binary where it's like, oh, you're either one thing or the other. And it's like, well, because they love to throw, it's just basic biology at us. And then we go, well, here's all these cases in nature where it's not XXXY, or it's not penis vagina, or it's not anything like that. And then suddenly their basic biology defense isn't so basic, and that involves thinking about it. So we have to just shut that down and just write us off as mentally ill. Yeah.
Well, and we know that othering is rooted in fear and ignorance. So what are, I'm sure you've thought through this, what are people afraid of?
Well, there's a variety of things that people are afraid of. I think one of the biggest things people are afraid of, especially straight men, is that they need to know that we're trans in case they accidentally end up attracted to one of us. Because if you're really attracted to a woman and you find out that she's trans, that might make you gay in their mind.
There's been scenes in movies like that.
Right, exactly.
Wasn't that Funky Cold Medina, or wasn't there a song that by Tone Loc where he took her home and turned out it was a guy?
Well, maybe. And of course, we haven't updated the terminology. That goes back a while. But this is not a new idea.
I just said he was a guy, and I'm assuming that just because he had a dick, he was a guy. And that's what you're giving pause to for my sake.
Right. Yeah, and I don't mind talking about this. This is so pervasive.
Yeah.
And, there's plenty of people who will say that, well, because you were born with this, you're this no matter what. And I have to say, anybody who meets me, if they think I'm anything but a woman, that's not my problem. Because I'm clearly a woman. I present as a woman. I say I'm a woman. My name is Marissa. That's all it should take. And just because I was born differently than most people does not mean I'm invalid. And it does not mean that someone else has more of a right to my identity than I do. Yeah. There are plenty of reasons I can say that I'm a woman, but the number one reason is that I say I'm a woman.
Yeah. I remember the first time I saw a lecture, Brian McLaren he's a Christian. He was teaching at a conference, and he was trying to stretch these Christians, and he did a PowerPoint, and he said, we've looked at sexual orientation as just binary. There's 2 buckets, there's straight and gay. And then he went into, it's more complicated than that, and he did an X and Y axis. And I think probably the x-axis was maybe masculine on one end and feminine on the other, and the y-axis was attracted to the opposite as opposed to attracted to the same. But the point is that instead of it just being two buckets, if you look at like our screens on our computers, they're pixelated, and every one of those little dots could be like that's a person on this XY axis as opposed to two buckets. And when I hear you say, I don't understand chromosomes, and I don't understand, I don't know, for that matter, human nature. But when, let's say somebody, like you were talking about, somebody might have male genitalia, but they have, what are the chromosomes that identify femininity?
XX.
Okay, so they've got a penis, and yet they're XX. So does that XX and that Y, does that influence? And I'm sorry to sound stupid, but like, girls like dolls, boys like trucks, or whatever. When it comes to toys, those kind of stereotypes or whatever is that chromosomal or is that even real?
I don't think it's real. I think those are stereotypes, and even if that is a majority true, it doesn't mean it's the case for everybody.
Yeah.
And Steve Shives did a great video about this recently where he compared it to learning that the planet Pluto was not a planet. And people resisted it because that's what they knew, that Pluto was a planet, and then it wasn't. But we got more information to figure out that it's part of the Kuiper Belt. And gender and sexuality are kind of the same thing. And people think that trans people just suddenly came out of nowhere in 2009 because of a post they saw on Tumblr or something, and that's not the case.
Yeah.
How could Pluto be a planet up until August of 2006, then all of a sudden not be a planet? What changed about Pluto? But of course, nothing changed about Pluto. What had changed between 1930 and 2006 was our understanding of our solar system. Given that new, more complete understanding, it made sense, to a lot of people anyway, including a majority of members of the IAU, to revise our concept of what a planet was. And that was an option because planet is a constructed concept. It's an idea that people invented that refers to an object that exists out there in the world. For that idea to be useful to us, it has to represent that actual object as accurately as possible. And if through the gaining of new information, we learn that our concept is not as accurate as we thought it was, the only sensible thing to do is to alter the concept accordingly. It's impossible for us to think about or talk about the world around us without using constructed concepts. The objects we define as planets would exist as they are whether we were here or not, but they're only defined as planets because we say they are. For everyday purposes, the distinction between a thing and our constructed concept of the thing isn't usually important. When we look at a tree, we don't think to ourselves, there is an object which exists independent of our perception of it, but which for our convenience we conceptualize as a tree. We think, there's a tree. We treat our idea of the thing as though it is actually the thing. We think of our concept of reality as though it were reality itself. Despite their necessity, our attachment to our constructed concepts can become a problem when we learn new information that challenges the long-held understanding on which those concepts were based. Which brings me to why trans women are women. Just as we all grew up in a world where it was an established scientific fact that Pluto was a planet, most of us also were taught to take for granted that gender was a binary concept. There were men, and there were women, and there were easily discernible factors that determined who belonged in which category. Most people regard the gender binary as a fundamental fact of life. It's basic biology. It's one of the first things we learn about ourselves. It's a major influence on how we organize our societies and how we perceive each other. Boy-girl, penis-vagina, sperm-egg, XX, XY. It's familiar, it's comfortable, it's common knowledge, and it's not fully representative of reality. And the XX equals woman, XY equals man dichotomy might account for the great majority of people, but it doesn't include everyone. And by the way, neither do the boys have a penis, girls have a vagina, or women make eggs, men make sperm dichotomies. Are those statements typically true? Yes. But are they rigid, immutable, universal truths? No. Reality, as it turns out, is a lot more complex than that. It's currently estimated that approximately 1 out of every 250 adults in the United States is transgender. That means their gender identity, their personal, internal experience of their gender, is different than the gender they were assigned at birth. If the constructed concepts we rely on to make sense of the world, the categories we sort things into, the terminology we use to talk about things, turn out to be inaccurate or inadequate, the only sensible thing to do is to revise those concepts, to augment them, to reinterpret them, to change them, to make them better represent reality as we understand it. Otherwise, they're not doing the job that we need them to be doing. If our concepts of gender account only for those who are in the majority, only for those who are typical, and ignore the significant percentage of people who exist outside of those traditional categories, then those concepts don't fully represent reality. They're not doing the job. We shouldn't be relying on them, and we most certainly should not be using them to justify bigotry and discrimination.
I've spent some time with native cultures. I was kind of socially adopted into what's called the Two-Spirit movement. And that goes back longer than this place was a country.
Yeah.
So there's so much variance, and there's so many different ways to approach ideas and perception and expression. It's just that some of us were forced into boxes that we didn't fit in, despite everyone trying to push us there and everyone trying to say, this is who you are. And despite all that, there are those of us who said, no, it's not. I'm going to live as I really am. And you would think with as many different kinds of people as we encounter every day, not every man is the same. Not every woman is the same. Not every straight person is the same. Not every gay person is the same. And when you meet that many different kinds of people, it blows some people's minds to then turn around and go, oh, well, that's not the way it's supposed to be. That you're either one or the other.
Isn't that true?
There's 32 NFL teams. Think of that variance. That's how many different fan bases exist. How many people could we walk up to right now and get a different favorite movie out of? It just blows my mind that some people are like, well, yeah, everybody's different. Everybody has a right to whatever.
Yeah.
But then tell someone that was assigned male at birth that they're a woman and suddenly, oh, no, you're not.
Out of bounds.
Yeah.
That's fascinating because I'm a people watcher. I love watching people, and I'm fascinated with the variations that can be done with 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. Uh-huh. And there's no two alike. This is not a politically correct term, but we're snowflakes, right?
Right.
There's no two alike. And yet, which everybody gets that. This is a great point. I love this point. Everybody completely acknowledges that. No question, no doubt, no argument. And yet, when you take it just a little bit further, that we're even more diverse than you thought, nope, out of bounds, can't go there.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's because it would require them to consider something else that they haven't learned before.
Yeah.
And you can see the difference between people who weren't raised with that and are suddenly forced to confront it with kids who were raised in the culture where trans people exist.
Yeah.
One of the first fears that everybody always goes to was, how did your kids feel about that? And my response is, I said, hey, I'm trans. This is how you knew me. This is how I actually am. And they went, oh, okay, when's dinner? Like, they don't care.
Awesome.
So
Yeah.
Just playing to that fear of how is it going to affect the children. Children don't care. Children are a lot more adaptable than we give them credit for.
Yeah.
So,
they're less brainwashed.
Exactly. Most of the resistance to these ideas are learned behavior.
Yeah.
And we also have to get past this idea that just because we reject that gender or just because we reject being straight or whatever it is, it doesn't demonize the social default. Just because I'm a trans person, it doesn't mean I think cis people are bad. Or just because I'm queer doesn't mean I think straight people are bad.
Yeah.
That's not how it works. It's only saying, this is what you thought I was. This is who I am. Please address me respectfully. Please call me what I tell you to call me. And don't deny me medical care or throw me out of your restaurant just because you may not agree with that.
Yeah. It's a strange thing. It's what I was asking earlier about what are they afraid of? And the first thing you mentioned was like straight men are afraid to take a woman to a hotel room and find out she's not a woman or whatever. But
well, we are women,
yeah.
But I get what you mean.
Yeah, thank you. But also I think what I'm curious about, and I'm sure that you've explored this as well, is just, all right, so I think that people, and I'm an Ernest Becker Denial of Death fan. It's a book about, how everybody, in order to get out of bed, we've had to create narratives that help us compartmentalize our self-awareness and that we're going to die, and we could die at any moment. Mm-hmm. So unlike, most animals, they barely know they exist, but they really don't have the foreknowledge that they're going to die. They have instincts to survive. But we as a human race, as prefrontal cortex, we uniquely know that we exist. We know that we're going to die, and we could die at any time because death is completely unknown and it's scary. Then there's this paralyzing fear that it has to be suppressed in order for anybody to just get out of bed. Anyway, So I think that people walk around with deep insecurities, deep fears, and we find, misery loves company, safety in numbers. We find a way to suppress our fears, just our existential fears, by buddying up and aligning with people, birds of a feather. That we get with people that are like us. And just like you're saying just now, that just because you're coming out as trans doesn't mean I'm attacking everybody who's not. Mm-hmm. Why do you have to take this personal? The war on Christmas doesn't exist. And yet, when somebody says, hey, you guys that are all about Christmas and are kind of maybe steamrolling the rest of us with that religion that we don't adhere to, hey, can you guys share the space, share the stage with Hanukkah or whatever, or some, winter solstice? And they're like, oh, we're under attack. It's just it's so common. And so anyway, that's what I mean by fear. It's like the reason that racism exists is, we're afraid of this or that. We're afraid of anything other than ourselves.
Yeah, and there's also, I think, a fear of implication, especially in racism, where people think that, okay, if Black Lives Matter is correct, then that means maybe I've been complicit, even unintentionally. And that's really hard to consider and think about. So I'm just going to pretend it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing that people do with gay people or trans people or non-Christian people. It's, hey, if what this person is saying, if this person has suffered because of people like me, then maybe I've contributed to that somehow. Mm-hmm. And that's really hard to think about.
Yeah, that's a tough mirror to look into. And we're offended and we're irritated by those that maybe not directly, but just by punching upward or just by trying to get a voice, we hold up that mirror. And
nobody wants to think of themselves as a bad person, and I get that. And nobody wants to think that maybe they've contributed to a kid committing suicide or, of someone who wasn't able to live as who they are because they were bullied so mercilessly. Yeah. But it's happened. Yeah. And we can either accept that and do our best to help those who are here, or we can keep pretending that they don't exist and make ourselves feel better by just writing them off as crazy or mentally ill or anything like that. What it always comes down to is, even if you don't believe I am who I say I am, even if you think it's a mental illness, it's not. But even if it was, it wouldn't matter.
Right.
It still doesn't justify treating us like shit or discriminating against us.
Yeah.
Because nobody's sitting there saying, oh, well, you have depression. You can't, go to the grocery store because I'm not depressed. That's not how it works.
Yeah. Well, you're a movie buff. And by the way, my co-host, Bob Pondilla, who's normally on the show, he makes short films. And so he would have loved being a part of this. You guys could have your terminology, your lexicon. But anyway, I'm sure that you've seen and have some thoughts, maybe in the context of what we're talking about, of Lars and the Real Girl.
It's been a long time.
Okay, so in the context of what you just said, as far as, let's say that somebody does say you have a mental illness, and it's not true, but even if they think that, they still, it doesn't change the price of eggs in Murfreesboro. I mean, like, it's still something that they don't have to attack or feel threatened by or take personal.
Yeah. Here's another great example.
Okay.
My great-grandmother had Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
So we had to remind her of things every day. We had to, and then eventually she forgot everything.
Yeah.
I don't think that would be, oh, well, she doesn't remember who you are. That means she never loved you in the first place.
Yeah.
Or, she has Alzheimer's. That means she can't have this particular kind of cake. That would be absurd. Mm-hmm. So trans isn't a mental disorder. It's not an illness. But even if it was, it wouldn't matter.
Yeah. And I think you obviously know the pitfall there is that if somebody, I mean, it's a step in the right direction for somebody to go, I hate you because you're different, to, okay, you're different because you have a mental illness. That's still very condescending and patronizing.
Yes, it is.
And you don't really want to know that they feel that way. But what you're giving them is at least leave me alone, or at least if the best you can do is sympathy, I'll take that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not ideal, because better to, go all the way to just full acceptance. Like you said, what's for dinner? Moving on. But if you're not going to get that, at least, you'll...
Well, it's not okay if you think it's a mental illness, because you're wrong. But the point is, even if you do think that, it doesn't mean we deserve to be treated as lesser. That's my point.
Yeah. Well, and neither one of you can control what the other one thinks.
Right. The best I can do is be honest. The best I can do is put myself out there, because, one of the main mantras that I live by is, you are correct that you have the right to disagree with me as to who I am and who I say I am. But I have the right to not have you in my life.
Yeah,
I have
for sure.
Right. I have the right to block you. I have the right to not consider anything else you have to say, because I have this life and this is who I am. And I know who I am better than anybody else does.
Yeah.
And you can disagree with that, but you don't have a place in my life if you do.
Absolutely. You got to be a person of boundaries. You're responsible for your own, not only well-being and safety and health, but happiness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think what we could say, because you just basically said, I reserve the right to be honest with myself, and I think we could say that of people on the other side, or whatever, of the other mindset. For example, Jordan Peterson probably thinks that he's being honest with himself. And what I think you're saying is, yeah, okay, you personally may not be malicious, but your ideas are. And
yes.
I'm gonna create some space and some boundaries from that ideology, because it's toxic for me. I'm keeping my head above water in my personal pursuit of self-love, self-acceptance, self-dignity, self-respect. And every time I hear that kind of venom or whatever, it infects, it just sets me back. And not only do I have no use for it, I deem it dangerous. And so,
yes.
I'm going to put up a boundary. Yeah, I get that.
Mm-hmm. There's this myth of the echo chamber that if we, take everybody out of our lives that supposedly disagrees with us, especially on social media, that we're creating some kind of echo chamber.
Yeah.
And, especially as trans people, it's like, no, we live in that world every day. I don't need it in my Facebook feed too. So, you have the right to say that bullshit, but I don't owe you my time or my space.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. Just surrounding yourself with people that agree with you, and pretty quick you have this reinforced, inbred ideology that's unchallenged by any scrutiny or scientific method or whatever they could say. But, when it comes to this particular issue, of which the world is ignorant. So to say, oh, you're asking me to go to you to learn more about transgender or learn more about myself? No. Mm-hmm. The community that is truly experiencing it, the research that's truly researching it. I'm going to go there. There's no point in you going to them to learn about this issue because they're even more ignorant than you are. So it's not an echo chamber. It's actually a place where there's more experts.
Yeah.
Okay, so how old are you now?
I'm 32.
And how old were you when maybe you began to acknowledge or understand that you were a woman?
Well, there's multiple answers to that, mostly because in the school district I grew up in and the culture I grew up in, I didn't have the word, but it was there from a very young age. I was a really feminine kid, and my parents, before I transitioned, loved to tell the story about how I never got holes in my jeans. Like that was a sign that maybe I was a weird kid because I didn't want to get dirty. I didn't tear my jeans. I was never like that. And I also remember being in middle school and high school, and most of my friends were girls. I identified with girls. I related to them better. Mm-hmm. And they would put makeup on me, and I liked it. I liked the way I looked, and I liked being part of that kind of social participation until I got beaten up for it once too many times. But I would say the first time that it really became part of my central identity was when I was about 18, and a friend of mine had a bit of a stalker, an ex-boyfriend, and she had said that she had a boyfriend and that didn't get him to leave her alone. And she said, well, what if you pretended to be my girlfriend, Marissa? And I was like, okay. So I dressed up and I went on a date with her just to get this guy to leave her alone. And it worked. And I just felt so different. I felt like myself because for my entire life, I felt like I was dissociated, just on the outside looking in constantly.
Yeah.
And suddenly here I was in clothes that more reflected who I was. I was in makeup and I felt pretty. And I became addicted to it. I couldn't go back to how I was. I didn't want to be called the name I was born under or the pronouns I used, but I stayed in the closet for 13 years.
After that after that epiphany.
Right. So, I lived with, how many different relationships where, at a certain point I'd be like, well, there's something you need to know. And it was something that I just kept very, very contained and lived with. And the first time I really tried to come out and live openly was in 2014. And unfortunately, a couple months into that, I was sexually assaulted twice in 1 week. And that really pushed me out. It numbed me. It made me hide because it was, if this is the world I'm coming into and this is the cost of being myself, I can't do it. I hid again until Pulse. And Pulse changed my life in more ways than one.
That's the club down in Florida?
Yes.
Yeah.
In Orlando.
Yeah.
And
where the shooting.
Yes. So when I saw the second name on the victims list had the last name McCool, I had this image of, if I had been there and that had happened to me, 99% of the people in my life would remember the wrong person. They would remember this front I put up, this image, this name that I don't even associate with, that isn't me.
You call it your dead name.
Yes.
Yeah, in the book.
Right. So when that happened, I said, I need to live as who I truly am, or I'm not living. Mm-hmm. And if something happens to me, I don't have the chance. I can't be remembered as someone I'm not. Yeah. I can't be remembered as this name that is not my name. So within a month, I was on hormones, and I kept it a secret for a little while. And then it just all at once, that day with that hate pastor in October of 2016, it all came out, and everything snowballed from there.
Is this Pastor Carl?
Yes.
I'd like to hear that story, but just to go back, the stalker boyfriend, you guys posed as lesbians, and he left you alone?
Yep.
And in the process of just dressing like a woman, it was like, I mean, it's kind of one of those happenstance. Like you happened upon this little exercise or this, experiment to run this guy off, and boom, my God, this feels so right.
Yeah.
And then 13 years later, So did I understand correctly in the book that at least one of your perpetrators of the assault was a woman?
Yes. In 2014, I was a girl was at my house, and she just would not stop touching me. I kept saying, I don't want to be touched right now. Mm-hmm. And she got really aggressive, so I left. And when I came back, I'd been drinking, and I went to bed because I thought, maybe me leaving the house would make her go away. And she came into my room and forced herself on me and put her hand around my throat until I stopped resisting. So it was a woman. Wow.
Well, all right. So what's the context in which this is a street preacher?
Yes. I call him Pastor Carl because he doesn't, I'm not going to use his real name, but he had been on our campus. Like, he was coming every 2 weeks at this point. And he's not just someone standing there with a microphone. He was someone who would follow kids around and shout slurs at them and just disrupt anyone's day. It's a private university, the University of Pennsylvania, but there's a public area called Locust Walk. It's right in the center of campus, and it's gorgeous, and it's technically considered a public area because people can walk through it. And he was just following kids, like 17, 18-year-old kids. He was calling women whores for having exposed shoulders. He was calling anyone with a hijab a terrorist. He was calling Jewish people names I won't repeat. He was and just constant. And I'm like, these are kids. I'm 30 years old. Like, nothing this guy's going to say matters to me. Mm-hmm. So I just started trolling him, and not in the way of telling him his God wasn't real or anything like that, but just in the way of, hey, we had to read more than one book to get in here. Why do you need those passages highlighted? You only had to study one book to get your degree. And saying things that just got under his skin, like, oh, how do you know the person that made that highlighter wasn't gay? Maybe you just desecrated your Bible. Maybe you're going to hell. And just getting under his skin, because he's not used to that. He's used to people screaming in his face. He's not used to people being a smartass. Mm-hmm. And about an hour and a half in of me just following him around, because I'm sitting there going, the more he talks to me, the less he's going to ruin a 17-year-old kid's day. Yeah. He goes, does anyone have the guts to be judged on the Bible? And I just went, pick me, Pastor Carl. And I handed my phone to the person next to me. I said, film this. And he starts asking questions like, have you ever drank alcohol? Yes. Oh my God, you're a drunkard. Have you ever had premarital sex? Yes. Oh, you're a whoremonger. Just all that bullshit.
Yeah.
Finally, he goes, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 you're going to heaven, 10 you're going to hell, you're a 9. At least you're honest about it, unlike all these people. And I just went, you want me to make it a 10? I'm transgender. Fuck you.
You went honest? And that was your first time to say it publicly?
That's how I came out.
Wow.
I'll send you the video if you want.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Sure.
So I've, in going through the book, there's some words that I just wanted we could talk about. Something, sure. Help me understand wrong puberty.
Okay, so there are people like me who weren't out as trans as kids. Mm-hmm. So I went through the wrong puberty. I went through male puberty, which it was incorrect. So when a trans person after puberty goes on hormones, they go through what's called second puberty. Oh. And we're going through the correct one. Mm-hmm. So when I got on hormones, I started going through second puberty, and it was completely different than childhood puberty. So that's what I meant. My brain was getting the wrong hormones, and everything was just a mess, but I didn't have the words for it at the time.
Yeah. Well, I think this makes me think of people who very shallow and myopic, but they just say, oh, it's not natural to be trans or even to be gay, if you want to get like to the hardcore homophobes. It's also not natural for your organs to turn on themselves, or for cancer, or for, stuff that our body does to itself or responds to germs or whatever, that's wrong. We could say that's not right. The body is not doing the right thing by the immune system is turned on itself or whatever.
Right. Maybe a child is born and their lungs aren't working right away, so they have to go, in the NICU and have artificial breathing for a while. That's not natural, but it's what the body needed to survive.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what being trans is like. It's like we have these hormones in our body, but we know they're incorrect.
Yeah.
And when we get the right ones, like the first time I took my hormones, it was like my brain was alive. It was like that experience where I wore the right clothes for the first time. It was like, oh, I get it now.
So do you still take estrogen or whatever?
Oh, yeah.
How many years you been on that?
I'm coming up on my 2-year anniversary.
Okay.
So I've been taking hormones for about close to 2 years.
Yeah, and I found your appearance striking because you not only wear makeup, you wear bright red and just very loud colors.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I found it attractive, to be honest.
Thank you. I don't do subtle.
Yeah, you don't do anything subtle. Okay, some other things that I just wrote a bunch of stuff on my whiteboard. You talk about your concussions. Is that from like people beating you up?
One of them was, but I call it the height of my overcompensation when I was in my 20s, where I was desperately trying to deny this fact about me. I became a professional wrestler, and there's nothing that quite says running from your identity than participating in something that's generally perceived as hyper-masculine.
Yeah.
So for a couple years, I trained and for a brief amount of time was a professional wrestler.
Wow.
And I got hit in the head hard.
With a chair.
That and other things, yes.
Yeah. So how tall are you?
I used to be about 6'3". I'm now about 5'11 and a half.
Wow. Is that the estrogen?
I believe so. Some trans women do experience a bit of shrinking because estrogen has an effect on your bone density. So sometimes we get smaller, which is
I'd
good
never heard of
me.
that.
Yeah.
So when you were a wrestler, you working out on weights?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you were, I'm sure you were pretty toned up.
I definitely wasn't like a bodybuilder type, but I was in pretty good shape.
Yeah.
Just every day working out, eating right, and getting thrown around a wrestling ring. Like that was peak physical performance as far as that goes.
Do you work out now?
In different ways. One of the other things that estrogen has an effect on is muscle, and I've lost probably half of my strength, but I walk a lot, I go hiking, and my job, I'm lifting a lot of cartons and things like that. So I get my exercise in, but there's no way I could do what I used to do physically. It's just not realistic.
Well, and on the flip side, I don't know, you can tell me whether this is, just ignorance. But, I see these women bodybuilders, and I'm sure they're taking steroids, but they're probably... might they also be taking testosterone? It's
possible, if not likely.
Well, their arms. Their arms start to look like men's arms.
Well, my husband is a trans man, and I can tell you the difference between trying to get estrogen and trying to get testosterone is a bureaucratic nightmare.
Okay.
My process was simply going to the doctor and going, I'm a woman, I want to go on estrogen. And they went, okay. He had to go through like 3 appointments and background checks and all this because testosterone, some people do use it as a steroid, and it's a lot quicker to have effect. Like I saw a video clip of his voice from a year ago and went, who's that? That's not my husband. It's really quite effective. So, even baseball players use like human growth hormone and stuff like that, and I'm sure it has a similar effect.
Yeah. I think I've been prescribed steroids, and maybe it's a different kind of steroids, but when I had poison ivy or something. Anyway. All right, so this term, allistic?
Allistic? Yes.
What's that?
That is the opposite of autistic. So a lot of the reason these terms exist is because for a while, things like straight or cisgender or anything like that were just called normal.
Yeah.
And, if you prescribe someone being straight and cis as normal, that makes us abnormal.
Yep.
And it's normal to be trans. It's normal to be gay. It's normal to be autistic.
Yeah.
So the word allistic, the word cisgender, the word straight are all just different terms to describe a person. And none of them, despite what people think, have any negativity attached to them.
Yeah. And you'd think we'd be okay with saying, hey, let's use terminology that's not at the expense of people that are not that.
Yes.
I don't know if I could say that sentence again. So, intersectionality, what is that?
Intersectionality is, a lot of times it's applied to feminism and activism, and it's the acknowledgement that people come from different backgrounds, and you would think that'd be obvious. But what I bring to the table as a 30-something trans woman is not the same as, say, a Latina trans woman. Like, it's just not the same experience. Trans women of color have a life expectancy of 35. So for all the shit that I as a white trans person have to deal with, it's far worse for trans, especially women of color.
Yeah.
So intersectionality is acknowledging we come from different places and we come from different experiences. And it's not a ranking system, but it is to say that I, as a white person, do not have the same experience as a black person, or I, as a trans person, do not have the same experience as a cis person or a straight person. And when you acknowledge that, you bring these different perspectives to the table, and it's a lot easier to have a conversation than it is to say, oh, well, we're all atheists and that's all that matters. And despite how some of the community leaders might like to think that's the case, it's not, because once we get beyond the God question, there are some of us who want to be heard and represented, and until recently we haven't been, and there's resistance to that.
Yeah. Well, that brings up an interesting point, because in the atheist movement, if you will, that we find, and I say we ex-Christians, and not just ex-Methodists like your mom, we were knee-deep in absolute certainty of God, of Jesus, of the Holy Spirit in my heart, guiding me, directing me, talking to me talking to him, believed it, wholesale, 100%. Mm-hmm. When we deconstruct all of that, poof, it goes up in smoke, the bottom drops out of your life. It's like we say on the show, it's like learning that your mother never existed. And so it's devastating, and we have a very different experience than lifelong atheists.
Right.
It's why I have Bob on the show, because he's a lifelong atheist. He doesn't understand one bit why we went into much ado about nothing. You poor souls, you put yourself through such misery for nothing, and, But anyway, in the movement, we're very different. We're very different. Yeah. And difference matters. Now, identity politics, where somebody says, you shouldn't make a big deal of your blackness, because after all, we're trying to get to this place of politics where we're colorblind, where we're just Americans, where we're just humans, and you keep bringing in your blackness, and it's reverse racism and all of this. Are you familiar with like John Rawls? He's a philosopher that came up with the term veil of ignorance.
I'm not, but I think I'm pretty familiar with at least a basic understanding of the concept.
Yeah, it's an idealistic thing to where if you're a legislator, you come into the table where we're going to make laws, we're going to write bills, and when you do, if you're male, you need to leave that at the door. If you're, white, you need to leave that at the door, because you're going to be legislating laws that affect people very much unlike you, and you need to be able to think generically, I guess. And, there's that theory. And when I first heard that, I thought, yes. And I think of Stephen Colbert when he says, I'm colorblind, and of course he's mocking that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, where I was going when I was talking about the difference in a lifelong atheist and a ex-Christian, difference matters. And so these people that are saying, hey, you keep bringing in your transness, to this conversation, and it really doesn't matter. You're trying to make it about you and your this or that. But I think there is a place where it matters. It matters that I'm black, and it matters where I'm. So if we are coming into a conversation where we're trying to steer culture with legislation or whatever, you can't just ignore the fact that you white people owned us for 500 years and have continued to suppress us through Jim Crow and other things. You start at the 50-yard line. We start at the 0. It's anyway, I'm a long rant to say, I'm sure that when it comes to politics or just culture, how do you feel when people try to say to you, quit bringing in your orientation or your identification? It doesn't matter.
Well, I honestly think they're trying to do what they think is the right thing. Mm-hmm. And I understand that. Mm-hmm. But that's something that's far easier to say when you've already been perceived as the social default. So if you're a white, cisgender, straight person, it's very easy to say, oh, well, labels don't matter to me. Why is that so important to you? But when, say, you've had to fight just to be recognized as equal or existing at all, it's very hard for you to say, oh, well, you need to drop that, because it's like, I had to fight just to be able to be acknowledged as who I am. And a lot of the issues that are present affect me. Trump just put forth another military ban
today,
on us.
Or yesterday.
And so I can't just sit back and go, oh, well, the fact that I'm trans doesn't matter here, because clearly it matters to them. Yeah. To assume that we can all be colorblind or orientation blind or gender blind or anything like that.
Culture blind, yeah.
Yeah, it assumes that we all start at the same place. And of course we don't. In an ideal world, we would, but that's not the case.
I don't know about that. I don't think it would be an ideal world. Well,
okay. So the opportunity for equality, if we all
that's
were afforded the same opportunity, that's what I meant. But until we have that, until we actually have that, instead of just certain people telling us that we have that and that we need to shut up about it, it's irresponsible. It ignores the experience. Yeah. It's a fact that young African-American men are being shot by the cops for holding a cell phone or wearing a hoodie. And if we take the fact that they're black out of it, it is to ignore the problem. It is to ignore that it is a certain group of people being targeted, the same way as it is to ignore the fact that trans people, especially trans women of color, are targeted and murdered at an exceptionally high rate. Yeah. So we can't ignore identity, because the people who tend to want us to ignore identity are the ones who've never had to worry about it.
Yeah. All right. So I've got on my arm, I tattooed this, and this is kind of Nietzschean. Nietzsche was critical of what he called resentment, which is French for resentment, and self-pity, and what he called upside down morality or slave morality. And he uses the Jews as an example. When they were suppressed, they basically said, well, it's good to be suppressed. Instead of overcoming and becoming strong, they said it's good to be weak. Blessed are the weak, or meek. Mm-hmm. The point being is that the tattoo I have on my arm says, my enemies: fear, pity, resentment, victimhood, and insecurity. And I say those are my enemies because I don't want to behave or act or talk coming from any of those places. If I say something or do something and it's coming from a place of fear, it's not who I want to be. I don't think it's good for anybody. So the way this comes into play is, let's say that you've got a bootstrapper, a real conservative guy saying, even if it's a black person, sometimes you find a black person who turns and says to the black community, you guys are killing yourselves, you're hurting yourselves by playing the race card. And if you would just be like me, who's the black politician that's a heart surgeon?
Ben Carson.
Yeah, Ben Carson's kind of like this. I mean, Ben Carson is critical of his own people when they, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I would say, it don't come from a place of self-pity or victimhood. I mean, you've been victims, and you have a right to be afraid of the white man or whatever, but try to come from a place where you're not operating out of poor little me. Be strong, but it's both and. Don't ignore who I am or my culture or what it took for me to get here. On the other hand, when you said, it sounds like all these default demographic people just wish or expect everybody else to, they don't understand when somebody says, this matters about me, and they don't get that. And I think what we're seeing with Trump and all the energy that just, my gosh, when he'd go and do these rallies, there was this dormant, what is it? The Kraken. Release the Kraken. My God, the energy and the venom. And I've just never, not only I'm shocked to see a human being so imbecilic have the highest office in the world, but I just didn't know how angry, how mean, how scared. And this is where I'm going, is that the powers that be can also operate from a place of fear, insecurity, victimhood. That's what I was talking about, the war on Christmas. Before long, they resort to being the victim, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, I don't know where I'm going with all this. I'm going to stop ranting.
It's okay.
I like to end with some personal questions like, what do you do for fun?
Well, when I'm not writing books and doing podcasts and going to cons, which does take up a bit of time, I really like doing photography. And I did photography for my close friend Callie Wright's wedding the same weekend.
Yeah.
I really like going on nature hikes. I like finding old railroad trails and things like that. That's something that's always been fascinating to me. I read a lot. I read about 60, 70 books a year. So I really do like to.
So let's talk about your books for a second. You got 5 books?
Yes. In addition to the one that I sent you, Passing Cars, the first one and probably the most successful one I've had was called The PC Lie, How American Voters Decided I Don't Matter. And I wrote it literally right after the election.
Yeah.
Started writing it about 6 days after the election, wrote it in 9 days, and had former NFL player Chris Cluey write the foreword and had some other atheist activist participation in the essays.
Yeah.
And I had that out before the end of 2016. I have 2 novels. One's called False Start and one's called Voice in the Dark. And I also have a book of poetry and essays called Silent Dreams. And right now I'm working on my 6th book, which is sort of in the spirit of the play The Vagina Monologues, except it's stories of trans people, people of color, from a bunch of different backgrounds, monologues of their stories. So that one's called Once Unspoken, and I'm hoping to have that out by May.
Cool. Well, I'm going to read, if you don't mind, an excerpt from your book, Passing Cars.
Sure.
And for the listener, this is not a representation of the rest of the book. This particular short chapter is very unique, and I was moved by it mostly because it's just so poetic and kind of cryptic, and so in fact so cryptic I want to ask you what it's about, what prompted this.
Sure.
And it's a chapter called The Moment After. The scent of damp bodily function wafted through the pitch-dark room. Slow, heavy breaths scored the otherwise oppressive silence. The clenching fingers were at war with the downy threads raging against each other. A single beat of sweat dripped down a glistening, furrowed brow. Breathing, unlike other instantly previous actions, was minimally consensual. Nervous metatarsals gripped the cold wooden panels, forming the pathway of momentary escape. The racing thoughts converged with the methodical, deliberate pace with which reprieve is gained. Solace found only in the hidden comfort of solitude. Presence regained its autonomy after its ultimate but temporary betrayal. Being alone is figurative, as the violator remains immediately above the present state of the stripped. The past force exerted to gain physical superiority continues to press firmly into the crushed veins and nerves of exacerbated vulnerability. Muse's cruel inspiration drips through the ethereal blackness, much like the foreign wetness invading the chambers of once held peace. In silence, there cannot be a calm that washes away these drops of unforgivable malice. Eyes eventually close, parting bittersweetly with the shock-induced numbness before trauma truly sets in the system. A subconscious reprieve is the only savior from the uncaring hand of reality, reinstating its monarchy over the peasants of Cope. But, like all monarchs, long shall they live, cruel shall they reign, but not tonight. So I just found that amazing. So what's going on there?
That is when I was finally able to recollect the moment after I was raped. And I briefly talked about the setup for that. But I was going through trauma therapy, and we did an exercise which had you draw different points of what happened, and non-sequentially. And the final drawing you would do was the moment in which the trauma happened. And I noticed all at once, not only did I not have a face in any of these memories, but I was seeing them almost from a security camera point of view. Like I wasn't in myself because I dissociated completely in order to survive. So when being forced to confront the fact that I wasn't in my own memory, I had to spend some time getting back into myself in those moments. And when I did, I was just overwhelmed with these emotions. And what I could focus on was describing what was around me and describing very little things, like the fact that I had bare feet on a wooden floor, and that I had a downy blanket, and that I just had that one little bead of sweat, and the scent of a foreign person where there shouldn't have been one.
Yeah.
And just remembering that, I just felt compelled to write it. And when it came out, I had to put it in the book, even though it didn't really fit with some of the other monologues, if you will, that I wrote in that book.
Yeah.
But considering the effect that moment had on me and how it prevented me from being myself for almost 2 years, it was crucial to the recovery process to get that out and be open about it and acknowledge it as part of my past.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know, man. I think that there is a season, I was talking about this tattoo on my arm, not to come from a place of victimhood. And I think there's a season to acknowledge that, yes, I was a victim, but is there ideally a season to where you say, but I'm no longer a victim. I'll never forget it, and I'll always have the scars, and I'll always walk with a limp, but that's not me.
I think, and this is just me, that everything that has happened has combined into who we are at that very moment.
Yeah.
And there are times where I still may feel like a victim, especially if I'm seeing someone I don't know and I'm not sure of their intentions. Mm-hmm. But a victim doesn't define who I am.
Yeah.
It doesn't define my very essence of being.
No, it's made you more protective than you would be without it.
Right. It's just part of my experience that has resulted in the place I am at this time.
Yeah.
So it's not for me to tell anybody else how they cope with trauma or how they perceive themselves, but it was part of my process to no longer having to deal with those nightmares and those memories that I had buried deep inside. Mm-hmm. And that's how I got past it. I used that experience to try to be stronger, to try to be more aware, to try to help others who might be in that situation. Mm-hmm. And that's how I chose to express it and move on from it.
Yeah. Well, and I imagine that there's, I was messed with by a babysitter when I was like 5, but as an adult, nobody's ever, assaulted me. But I think maybe somebody who has been would read that and go, I know what she's talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause yeah. So maybe one more question to just maybe end on a different note than that. Have you done any traveling outside the U.S.?
A very little bit. It's a very difficult process to get your passport as a trans person because you have to get everything else changed first so that it'll match.
Yeah.
And where I live now is very close to Canada for more reasons than one. You know, it's an escape route if necessary. But also growing up as I did, I was on my own at a very young age, and I was working most of my life in retail, so I didn't have the opportunity to save for that kind of travel. But now that my business is in order and I'm starting to get the chance to speak all over this country, I've gotten, a little bit of interest in speaking in other countries. So I think that's on the horizon, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mentioned passport. This very morning, I went up to the post office and applied for a passport. It was, my wife and I are going to Barcelona this summer, and there it is, the little box that says male or female. I mean, that's on a lot of forms, but I think about it now, as far as. And then did you officially change your name?
Yes,
okay.
I did that.
And you changed your last name?
No.
Oh, that's your birth name, McCool?
I retained the last name that I was born with, but I don't use it in anything but medical and identification purposes, simply because my birth last name is so rare that anybody who has that last name is directly related to me.
Yeah.
So I kept it because it means something to my family, but because that last name is so rare, I don't want what I do to come back and damage my kids, or because of the vitriol that's out there, it can unfortunately be attached and cause them problems. So I thought it would be just something to at least put a little bit of a barrier into anyone messing with them.
Yeah. You have a child.
Yes, I do. I have 2 kids, and that came about from getting someone pregnant when I was about 20, and that happening one more time before the split happened. We were together less than 2 years. I was very young and just trying to do the right thing, and obviously running from who I was, and that seemed like a good way to hide from it. So I have full custody of them. They live with me. I don't regret it.
Right.
It came about at a time that I was much younger and fighting who I was, and now I have them with me, and they, of course, fully accept me and refer to me correctly as who I am. And
yeah. And how old are they?
They are 10 and 9.
Now, when the 4 of you go out to a restaurant, I'm just asking, like, is it getting easier? Or do you get heckled, or?
It depends on where we are. For the most part, most people don't directly do or say anything, but when you're being stared at.
Yeah.
Where we live is a very safe place for trans people and queer people in general. Mm-hmm. I live in the Twin Cities, which is I affectionately refer to it as queer utopia.
Yeah.
But if we went back to Pennsylvania, it's not nearly the same unless we're in Philadelphia or something. So I would say it's a lot better than it used to be. But once again, I know when I'm being stared at, and instead of trying to hide from that, I have the purple hair and, as you put it, the very vibrant colors. So as long as they're going to stare, I'm going to own it.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thanks so much for coming on and sharing your story and putting up with my white cis straight, or what do you call het?
Short for heterosexual, of course. And, it's just, I don't mind at all. I go on shows and do speeches all the time that are 101. And the key is knowing when someone is trying to learn and when someone is malicious. And most of us can tell that difference.
Yeah. So thanks again, Marissa. This has been really cool.
Absolutely.